I wake to the sound of metal breathing around me, in not the reassuring hum of machinery I'm used to, but something else, a slow, heavy respiration, as if the ship itself were alive and uneasy in the darkness of my cramped quarters. I hold my breath and listen. There it is again. A rhythmic rise and fall, too deliberate to be the ventilation fans, too bestial to be anything mechanical. My heart thuds in my chest. It's probably just in my head. At least that's what I tell myself. Welcome to life aboard the Imperial void ship Sanguine Stars. And more specifically, welcome to my life down in the guts of this vessel, where reality wears thin. My name is Marcus Grime, and I am a Gellar field technician in the grand hierarchy of the Imperial Navy's finest. I'm basically the one poor soul standing between our ship and utter damnation. If I do my job right, nobody notices. If I screw up, well, nobody's left to notice. They say there are a million ways to die in the 41st millennium. Step outside without a void suit and you'll flash freeze before you can blink. Piss off a space marine, and you'll be a red smear on the bulkhead. But those deaths are almost merciful compared to what happens if the Gellar field fails during warp travel. Imagine being locked in a pitch-black room with all your nightmares made flesh, and you're getting close. The truth is, every time we translate into the warp, every single soul on board is dangling by a thread over a hellish abyss. And my job, my sacred emperor-blessed duty, is to keep that thread from snapping. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Believe me, I never thought I'd end up here. Growing up on Ceres Prime, I figured I'd maybe join the Hab militia or sweep manufacturing floors, not spend my days and nights praying to machine spirits on a warship far from home. But fate, or the departmental munitorium's infinite wisdom, had other plans. I had a knack with machines, see, and that was enough to conscript me into the Navy's technical crews. Before I knew it, I was shipped off to the Mechanicus for training. 6 months of being lectured by tech priests who speak binary more fluently than Gothic, getting my knuckles rapped for missing a single syllable in the litany of ignition. But I learned that every cog has a spirit, every circuit an inner litany, and that if you don't plate the engine's soul, it will kill you. Now I maintain the Gellar field generator aboard the Sanguine Stars, a grand cruiser assigned to Battlefleet Orpheus. She's an ancient vessel, older than my great-grandfather's great-grandfather. Beautiful in her own Gothic way, sure, but temperamental as a hive-whirled ice, and twice as likely to stab you in the back. I spend most of my time crawling through maintenance ducts and vaulting over plasma conduits in the belly of this beast, tightening bolts on archaic machinery that keeps us tethered to reality. I've lost count of the number of times I've scalded my hands on hot coolant pipes or woken up with engine grease caked in my hair. All that hardship for a job that, if I do it perfectly, means absolutely nothing happens, because nothing happening during warp transit is the best outcome we can hope for. No news is good news. A quiet day is a blessing. You only get excitement when things go wrong, and out here wrong can get very, very ugly. So why am I telling you all this? Because on our last journey through the Inmaterium, the warp, that hellish sea of souls, we had a bit of, let's call it an incident. And by the Emperor's teeth, if I don't get this off my chest, I think my mind might just snap. Maybe this record will be found floating in the void someday, or maybe it's just for my own sanity. Either way, consider it a warning, a first-hand account of what it's like to dance on the edge of the warp without falling in. Strap in, because it's a hell of a tale. And it all started just before we made the jump into warp space during our voyage to Marina Outpost. A day when everything was routine until suddenly it wasn't. The day was, as I said, routine. We were a week into our journey, cruising through real space on plasma drives toward the Marina outpost. The sanguine stars had so far seen nothing more exciting than the occasional micrometeor pinging off the void shields. My console in the Gellar field controller cove was green across the board. Field harmonics steady. Generator coils within optimal temperature. Textbook conditions. Translation to the warp in 1 hour, came the sonorous voice of Captain Arasus over the Vox speakers. It echoed through every corridor and compartment, even down in the belly of the ship. I could hear the authority in that voice. All hands finalized preparations and secure for warp transit. Emperor's guidance, be with us all. I felt a familiar pinch of anxiety in my gut at those words. No matter how many translations I go through, that announcement always gives me a chill. I swallowed it down and got to work. There's a whole checklist to run through before a warp jump, and the Gellar field is top of the list. In the generator chamber, deep amidships, the air was thick with incense. Tech Adept Yari was swinging a sensor back and forth, wafting sacred fumes around the hulking Gellar field generator. The machine itself towered 3 times my height, a mass of gleaming brass conduits and rune-etched plating, thrumming with barely contained power. Cables as thick as a man's torso snaked out in all directions, linking the generator to nodes at the ship's hull. Those nodes, dozens of them, would project the protective bubble around us once we breached the veil of reality. I moved through the half-light of the chamber, checking readouts and chanting a few standard prayers under my breath just to be safe. I tightened any loose connectors I could find. Yari, her face hidden behind a rebreather mask, kept up the droning rite of sanctified transition as she passed each console, incense curling in her wake. We weren't exactly friends. She's more cog than human some days, but we respected each other's work. She responded to my nod with a cursory binary chirp of acknowledgement. Mechanicus folk aren't big on small talk, especially not before something as critical as a warp jump. My palms were sweating in my gloves as I keyed in the final sequence of pre-jump diagnostics. Lumens flickered in the vault-like chamber, casting dancing shadows across the skull and cog motifs on the walls. Over the ship-wide vox, I could hear the muffled murmur of the crew and clergy reciting the litany of protection, a tenseness in those voices, hundreds of souls all whispering the same prayers at once. It was an eerie chorus, but oddly comforting in its unity. Gellar field integrity at 100%. No fluctuations, I reported into my handheld vox to the bridge. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Acknowledged Technician Grime, crackled the reply from a junior officer. Stand by. Translation in 5 minutes. I slipped the vox back on my belt and stood by my post, eyes on the main field conduit pressure gauge. This was the moment of truth. In these last minutes, an uneasy hush fell over the Inmaterium. Yari had finished her circuit and stood across from me, her augmented eyes dimly glowing. I could hear her modulated breathing. We exchanged a look, no words needed. From somewhere far above, the deep toll of a ship's bell resonated. 1, 2, 3, signaling the final countdown to translation. In the gloom of the engine decks, I glimpsed voidsmen making quick signs of the Aquila over their chests. I did the same. Emperor, protect us. When the bell fell silent, a new sound rose, a high-pitched whine from the warp engines as they powered up. The whole ship seemed to vibrate with anticipation. I braced myself, gripping a railing with one hand and clenching my jaw. Translation in 10-9-8. The vox caster clicked and popped with each number as the helmsman counted down. My heart was thewing. I mouthed a snippet of the machine prayer. Blessed Omnisia, hold us in your grasp. 3, 2, 1, translate. Reality shuddered. That's the only way to describe it. One moment I felt the familiar pull of gravity, the steady thrum of our plasma drives, and the next everything lurched. My stomach flipped as if I were falling from a great height, even though I stood on solid metal decking. The light took on a weird pallid hue, colors strained beyond the normal spectrum. For an instant, a burst of static filled my ears. Or was it screaming? I can never tell. There was a sensation of pressure as though an immense invisible weight pressed in on the hull from all sides. The transition shock. It's like the universe holds its breath when you rip a hole into the warp. I heard a few distant clatters and thumps, unsecured tools, or perhaps a crewman who lost footing. I hoped everyone was strapped in somewhere. I stayed rigid, wide-knuckled on the rail, as space itself yawned open and swallowed us whole. Then, just as abruptly, it was over. The initial jolt passed, and the ship settled into a new kind of motion, a gentle swaying like a ship on a calm ocean. Except the sea beneath us was not water, but the raw roping chaos of the Inmaterium. We had transitioned. We were in the warp. Immediately I snapped my eyes to the Gellar field status runes. A row of green lights pulsed steadily along the console. The blessed machine spirit had held. Our bubble of reality was intact, shielding us from the hell outside. I released the breath I'd been holding. Every time it amazes me, this ancient device doing the impossible, keeping the monsters at bay. Emperor be praised. All systems nominal, Yari intoned, a mechanical voice breaking the silence. I realized I had been hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. Gellar field holding steady, I added. Voice. From the Vox came the captain's voice once more. Translation complete. We are now transiting the Inmaterium. Maintain prayer until further notice. The Emperor protects. Across the ship I could faintly hear the crew's murmured prayers resume. A few sobs of relief perhaps. It wasn't uncommon for the green crewman to weep after a safe jump. I allowed myself a small sigh. The first hurdle was cleared. We were alive and sane for now. I glanced at Yari and offered a shaky grin. Textbook jump, eh? I said, trying to break the tension. Her respirator hissed. Maybe it was a chuckle, maybe just releasing pressure. Hard to tell with her. All parameters within acceptable thresholds, she replied. Ever the literal mechanicus, I shrugged and wiped the sweat from my brow. I'll take that as a yes. Around us the engine noises began to normalize. The warp drives engaged fully now. A deep throb in the background of reality like a distant heartbeat. The plasma drives were idle, while we swam the currents of unreality. The Gellar field generator emitted a constant low hum, barely audible unless you were listening for it. I always listen for it. That hum is the most beautiful sound in the galaxy. To me it means we're safe. Of course I know better than to trust it blindly. Safe in the warp is always a relative term. I've heard of ships that translated with everything green, just like us, only to vanish without a trace mid-voyage. I've seen crew lose their minds despite the field holding. The warp has a way of seeping in through the cracks of the human soul, even when it can't breach the hull. But those were grim thoughts for later. Right now, duty called. The first couple of days in the warp passed in relative calm, or at least what passes for calm on a void ship. Skimming through nightmares, we fell into the familiar routines that keep everyone busy, and not dwelling too much on where we are.
The sanguine stars maintained a cycle of shipboard day and night through the lighting systems, trying to preserve some sanity among the crew. During the days I performed my rounds, checking the Gellar field relays on various decks, recalibrating equipment, reciting the prescribed litines over any room that showed the slightest flicker of deviation. The work never stops. If something isn't broken, you check it again anyway. Even with everything functioning, the warp has ways of reminding you it's there. On the second day of transit, I was midway through recalibrating a tertiary field emitter down on deck 22, when I felt a sudden prickle on the back of my neck like I was being watched. I clicked off my spanner and glanced around the
empty corridor. The emitter node sat between two massive power conduits, both humming steadily. The air was warm, tinged with the smell of ozone from the generator coils. Nothing seemed out of place, yet for a moment I could have sworn someone stood right behind me. I breathed a quiet prayer and shook it off. When I reported the emitter status, all green, to Engineer Holstad, my immediate superior, I casually mentioned, "Any crew working near Junction 22A a minute ago thought I saw a shadow." Holstad gave me a long look through his augment eye, then simply intoned, "Negative. Maintain focus. Grime. The warp plays tricks." That was all he said. He was right. Of course, warp travel can mess with the senses. Shadows move where they shouldn't. Distant sounds echo down corridors that are empty. You brush it off as imagination, because what else can you do? If we jumped at every odd noise, we'd all be in the medic ward for hysteria. After my shift, I headed to the mess hall to grab a ration bar and recaf. That prickle of unease still clung to me like oil. The mess was dimly lit, filled with the low chatter of off-duty crew trying to act normal. People laughed a bit too loudly, spoke a bit too fast, the way folks do when they're nervous, but don't want to show it. I found my buddy, armsman Lauren, at a corner table. Lauren was one of the ship's security detail, a solid fellow I've known for a year now. We've played countless rounds of Rexide poorly and swapped dirty jokes in the barracks. If anyone could lighten the mood, it was Lauren. "Hey Marcus." Lauren greeted me, forcing a grin as I sat down. "How's our golden bubble holding up?" "Holding," I said, tossing him a wrapped Nutribar from my tray. "The day it doesn't, you'll know," he snorted. "I expect I'll be a pretty red mist if that day comes." I tried to smile, but it came out weak. At least it'd be quick. "That's so," piped up another voice. Jonas, one of the junior navigation ratings, who was nursing a cup of recaf at our table. He was pale and had dark circles under his eyes. A lot of the navigators' attendants looked like that. The warp wears on them too. I hear, if the Gellar field fails, it's not quick at all. A mate on my last ship said he saw it happen on a troop transport in the Voss Gap. Jonas's voice had dropped to a whisper. Lauren and I exchanged looks. "Oh yeah," Lauren prompted, cocking an eyebrow. I could tell he was skeptical, but morbidly curious. Josiah swallowed. They had a flicker, just a fraction of a second, but that was enough. Something got in. He wouldn't say what, just that whole compartments went dark, and people started screaming. By the time they restored the field, half the deck was just gone, and the rest were butchered meat. He shuddered and stared into his cup. Inquisitors quarantined the ship after that. Never saw my friend again. A heavy silence fell between us. That kind of tale is the last thing you want to hear in the warp, but such ghost stories circulate among voidsmen like some awful campfire lore. Lauren forced a chuckle, breaking the spell. Sounds like a load of grow dung to me. Inquisitors flickering fields. Next you'll be saying the Emperor himself came to swat the beasties. But I could see the unease in his eyes. We all knew Jonas's story could be true. There are plenty of ships that never make it to port, and the official reports just list warp mishap as cause. Just keep that field steady, Marcus, Jonas said with a one attempt at a smile. People like me, we're counting on people like you. Don't worry, I replied, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. I've got one job, and I aim to do it well. Lauren managed a thin grin and clapped me on the shoulder. When we get to Marian Outpost, we're sharing a stiff drink and laughing about all this, he said. First round's on you, Grin, I chuckled, feeling some of the tension break. It's a deal, I replied, hoping we would live to keep that promise. We changed the subject after that. Lauren cracked a joke about a Navy bosun and an O'Green in a bar, and Jonas rambled about how he couldn't wait to finish this voyage and see a real sky again. I nodded along, even managed a laugh or two, but a part of me was distracted, replaying that moment at the emitter node and Jonas's grim tale. That night cycle, back in my bunk, I struggled to sleep. The ship's illumination was turned to its low reddish nighttime setting. In the barracks module where West Tech slept, it was quiet aside from the hum of life support. I lay on my narrow cot, staring up at the riveted metal ceiling just a few feet above me. Normally I'm dead tired after a shift, but my mind churned. Every creak in the hall made me flinch. Was that just thermal expansion or something else? Eventually exhaustion dragged me into a restless sleep, and with sleep came the nightmares. I dreamt I was down in the generator chamber, alone. The usual thrum of the Gellerfield generator was silent, utter silence, except for a drip of liquid echoing somewhere in the dark. In the dream, the lumens were flickering, painting the machinery in stop-motion flashes of light and shadow. I moved between the towering conduits, calling out, but my voice made no sound. The air was stifling, thick like soup. As I approached the central console, I saw that the floor was slick with something. I touched it, blood warm and fresh on my fingertips. I looked up at the generator coils and nearly screamed. There was a figure bound to the main conduit, wrists and ankles fused into the metal, as if grown there. It was Engineer Holstad. His augment eye dangled from its socket, and his mouth was open in a soundless wail. A gaping wound opened in his torso, and from it spilled not organs, but a flood of tiny chittering insects that swarmed across the floor. In the dream, I stumbled back, horrified, slipping in the blood. That's when I felt hot breath on my neck, like an animal snarling right behind me. I jolted awake, nearly cracking my skull on the low ceiling of my bunk. I was drenched in sweat, heart hammering so loud, I was sure it would wake the others. In the darkness, the red glow of the emergency lumen cast everything in faint crimson. Bunks above and below were filled with the curled shapes of fellow tech adepts, sleeping or fitfully dreaming. No sign of anything out of the ordinary, just a nightmare. Throne, I whispered to myself, wiping my face. Just a nightmare. I swung down quietly and took a long gulp from the recycled water flask by my bed, trying to steady my nerves. Dreams, they're always bad in the warp. We all get them. Emperor knows I've had my share, but that one felt especially vivid. I could still almost smell the blood. I muttered a quick litany to the god Emperor under my breath, until I felt the fear ebb a little.
Eventually I fell back into a lighter, dreamless sleep born of pure exhaustion. The next morning, I shrugged off the night's terrors and got back to work. Everyone did. What else can you do? Life aboard continued. Endless maintenance checks, monitoring the field, minor repairs here and there. Enginal was everywhere on the Vox, coordinating the tech teams, ensuring we all stayed sharp. He was diligent like that, a veteran of dozens of warp crossings, short on patience maybe, but reliable. Hearing his clipped, precise orders gave me some reassurance. Holstadt would never let things slide. If there were any real issues with the field, he'd be on it in an instant. By the third day in the warp, the crew's nerves had settled a bit. No further odd incidents were reported, at least through official channels. There were whispers of a few ratings visiting the ship's confessor, claiming they heard voices in their dreams or some nonsense, but to most it was just typical warp jump jitters. The confessor, Father Carpus, held extra prayer sessions in the main chapel to bolster morale. I went once, more for something to do during downtime than out of fervent piety. I remember him thundering from the pulpit, "Though the void rages around us, we shall not fear. The Emperor is our light in the darkness, a beacon against the madness of the warp." It was rousing stuff, though I caught more than one crewman nodding off midsmon. Better sleepy than panicked, I suppose. On the surface things seemed normal, yet I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread coiling in my gut. Maybe it was just that nightmare clinging to me, or Jonas's story, or that damnable feeling of being watched that came and went. I started noticing little things, the way the OSP's readings would spike for no reason, and then normalize. Or how sometimes when I was alone at a checkpoint, the overhead lumen would dim and brighten, as if something passed briefly between me and the light. Each time I told myself it was just a fluctuation in the power flow, a common enough occurrence on ancient ships, and each time I wasn't entirely convinced. Still, I focused on the logic of the machine and the tasks at hand. Check the capacitor banks, recalibrate the field phase modulators, log the readings, repeat, focus on the rituals and the maintenance, and ignore the fancies of the human mind. That's what Engine Holstadt would say, and he was right until, of course, he was proven wrong. It was on the fourth day of our warp transit that the illusion of normality shattered. I was in the mid-deck generator monitoring station around the 15th hour of the ship's cycle, running a routine power flow analysis. My mind was mostly on autopilot, punching numbers into the coitator slate, when a sudden jolt nearly threw me from my seat. It felt as if the ship hit an invisible reef. The deck lurched sideways, tools and data slates clattered to the floor. I grabbed the console to steady myself. Immediately, an alarm began blaring, a harsh bleeding klaxon I had only heard in drills. Amber runes flashed on the Gellar field status panel. My stomach dropped as I read the display. Field fluctuation, containment breach. What in terror's name? I spat as I slammed a rune to initiate emergency protocols. My ears popped. A pressure wave rippled through the air like the ship itself gasped. The lights overhead flickered madly, plunging the corridor into a strobe of brightness and shadow. Over the howl of alarms, I heard it. A noise that cut through the klaxon's wail like a knife. A screech, wet and shrill, resonating from somewhere close. It wasn't metal strain or any Vox feedback I'd ever known. It was alive, and enraged. Heart-hammering, I snatched up my portable Vox. "Engine deck report." I shouted into it, uncertain if anyone could hear me over the alarms. "Gellar field fluctuation detected. Possible breach." Repeat. "Possible breach." Static. Then a burst of panicked shouting from multiple channels at once. "Deck 12. Something is in here by the throne." "What is that?" "Shoot it. Shoot." Security to engineering on the double. We have the channel devolved into screams, and the hollow bang of gunfire echoes. My blood ran cold. Something had gotten inside. I cursed and tore my gaze from the Vox. Focus. My job was to stabilize the Gellar field. Now or more horrors would flood in. My hands flew over the console, trying to rank the field's harmonics. The fluctuation had been sharp but brief. Already the readings were trending back to normal. Emperor be praised. The field hadn't collapsed entirely, more like a momentary flicker, but it was enough. A ragged human scream sounded from just around the bend of the corridor behind me. My skin crawled. That's where Junction 15B, a maintenance hub, was located. Another scream cut off abruptly. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The emergency bulkhead doors were starting to seal off sections to contain whatever had boarded us. But I realized with a spike of terror that I was now effectively isolated in this small monitoring station. One heavy door had slammed down just 10 m to my left, separating me from Junction 15B. And whatever was happening there, I heard heavy footsteps beyond the bulkhead running. Then a wet thud, and a gurgling cry. My mouth went dry. Should I go help? Stay at my post? Duty won out over fear. The field first. Always the field first. If it failed again, we'd all be dead anyway. Fingers flying, I rerouted power from non-essentials to the Gellar generator, reinforcing the bubble. The amber alarms gradually shifted back to green. Containment nominal for now. I was panting, only dimly.
Aware that I'd been muttering prayers under my breath the whole time, the immediate crisis on the console seemed handled, but the noises coming from beyond that sealed bulkhead were not letting up. I could hear shouts louder now that the alarms had quieted, definite gunshots, the hoof of a flamethrower, then an inhuman bellow that rattled my bones. I unclipped a tool from my belt, a hefty wrench, utterly inadequate as a weapon, but it made me feel a sliver less helpless. With trembling steps, I approached the bulkhead. There was a small vision slit of armored glass at chest height. Bracing myself, I peered through. On the other side, the corridor was bathed in the intermittent flash of emergency strobes. I saw a figure hunched over something on the floor. A crewman in engineering coveralls lay unmoving, and atop him, Emperor have mercy. It was a monstrosity out of a lunatic's nightmare. The thing had the rough shape of a man, but spindly and elongated. Its skin glistened wetly, an angry bruise purple that seemed to writhe with veins of black. It craned a bald, swollen head upward, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was all wrong. Eyes like smoldering coals set in a layering, distorted parody of human features. In its claws, Emperor, it had claws. It clutched the limp body of the crewman, and it was feeding, tearing into him, with a myth full of needle-like teeth. I choked back bile. My mind rebelled. This can't be real. This can't be real. But the gore splattered across the deck was very real. Suddenly, a burst of fire illuminated the scene. A tongue of flame washed over the creature, engulfing it in hungry orange. Behind it, two security arms men came into view. One hefting a navalist issue flamer, the other leveling a shotgun. It was Lauron with the flamer. Emperor, bless him, and he was shouting something, face twisted in determination and horror. The warp spawn shrieked as fire danced across its unnatural flesh. It dropped the charred corpse of the crewman and recoiled, thrashing. The other armsman opened up with his shotgun, each blast echoing like thunder in the confined hall. I saw bits of purple flesh explode off the creature's torso, sizzling in the intense heat. For a heartbeat, I thought the demon, what else could it be, might actually go down. But with startling speed, it lunged through the flames, slamming into the shotgunner. The man screamed as those claws sank into his midsection, and with a vicious twist ripped him open in a spray of blood. "No!" I shouted, banging helplessly on the bulkhead door. Lauron yelled in fury and doused both the creature and his dying comrade in another furious blast of fire. The demon roared, a hideous keening sound. Its flesh was burning, sloughing off in oily chunks, but it still swiped at Lauron with one smoldering arm. The blow caught my friend and hurled him against the corridor wall. I saw him crumple, flamer clattering from his hands. He moved, struggling to rise, but too slowly. The horror stalked toward him, trailing smoke, its ruined face twisted with rage. I couldn't watch my friend be butchered, not without doing something. Without thinking, I slammed my fist on the emergency release rune for the bulkhead. There was a grinding of gears. With a groan, the thick door began to retract. The moment the gap was wide enough, I squeezed through, wrench in hand. The heat hit me first, waves of it from the burning promethium, still clinging to the creature, the stench of charred meat, and something acrid assaulted my nose. I forced myself forward. The demon loomed over Lauren's fallen form, raising a claw for the killing strike. "Hey, over here, you filth!" I bellowed, channeling every ounce of terror and adrenaline into anger. I swung my wrench at its back with a desperate two-handed strike. The steel tool smashed into the thing's spine with a heavy crunch. I'd love to say I heroically snapped its back, but it was more like swatting a grow. I probably just made it mad. Still, I hit hard enough to get its attention. It howled more in fury than pain, I suspect, and whirled on me with blinding speed. Up close, under the strobing red emergency lights, I saw the demon fully. It was taller than a man by a head, limbs too long, and bent in wrong places. Black ichor oozed from where its flesh burned, and the smell thrown. The smell was pure corruption, like an open crypt mixed with sulfur. Its eyes locked onto me, and I felt a force like a physical punch to my psyche. A wave of hate so palpable, I nearly fell backward. The creature swung a claw, and I barely ducked in time. I felt the swoosh of displaced air, and heard razor-sharp talons whistle past my ear. It lashed out again, and I threw up my arm. Agony seared across my left forearm as its claws rad. My auto-reactive worksuit probably saved my limb from being torn clean off, but 4 bloody gashes opened through the fabric, hot blood running to my fingertips. I screamed in pain, stumbling backward. Before it could press its advantage, a new barrage of gunfire lit up the corridor. Several more armsmen had arrived, 4 or 5 maybe, firing volley after volley into the demon. Bullets and searing last bolts tore into its smoldering body. Distracted by my presence, it failed to dodge the brunt of it. Chunks of unnatural flesh exploded, ichor splattering the bulkheads. Under this combined fire, the creature finally collapsed to its knees, its form flickering in the half-light. Its cold red eyes dimmed, perhaps more out of malice than fear. With a final guttural snarl,
It crumpled to the deck in a heap of steaming gore. Even then, the armsmen didn't stop. They kept shooting, riddling the corpse until it began dissolving into an oily black slurry. Only when nothing remained but scorch marks and viscera did they cease. Chest heaving, I lowered my makeshift weapon. My injured arm hung at my side, throbbing and slick with blood. I became aware of the pain, but also of the flood of relief that the thing was dead or banished. Whatever happens to warp spawn when they're destroyed, the emergency lighting still flashed, casting the carnage in hellish red intervals. 2 armsmen rushed forward to tend to Lauren. He was alive. I could hear him groaning, but badly battered. The man who'd been torn open lay motionless, beyond any help. Another fallen crewman farther down. Emperor, it was a bloodbath for those poor souls caught in the initial breach. But it could have been far worse. A half-dozen bodies could have easily been 600, if more of those things had gotten in. Tech priest, seal that door. Are there more coming? One of the armsmen barked at me, adrenaline sharp in his voice. Only then did I remember the Gellar field. With shaking hands, I checked the console by the bulkhead. Blessedly, it showed green. Field is holding. I managed, my throat raw. No further breaches. Emperor willing. That was the only one. The armsman's squad leader nodded curtly. He had a deep gash across his cheek, splattering blood down his uniform, but he seemed not to notice. Medici team is on the way. Good work, all of you, he said to his men, then glanced at me. And you, Tech Emperor, knows what you did out here. But it was damned brave. I wasn't feeling particularly brave. I was shaking like a leaf, adrenaline crash hitting me hard, but I just nodded. My friend, I gestured to Lauren, who was propped up now by another crewman. Will he? He'll live. Lauren groaned himself, answering as he tried to sit upright. His face was ashen, but he forced a grin that turned into a grimace. Took a nasty knock, but I've had worse bar brawls. Ever the stubborn one. I let out a breath. I didn't know I'd been holding. Moments later, the Medici team and more security arrived. In the flurry of activity, tending to the wounded, covering the bodies with shrouds, spraying the corridor with cleansing sanctifiers, I found myself standing aside, my back pressed to the corridor wall. My arm had gone numb, blood dripping from my fingertips onto the metal floor. One of the Medici staff noticed my state and hurried over, ushering me to sit and quickly wrapping an antiseptic-soaked bandage around my forearm. The cuts would need proper stitching and some synth skin, but I barely registered his words. My eyes were fixed on the charred, slimy remains of the creature. Already its corpse was evaporating into an oily black vapor that clung to the deck. One of the ship's junior priests stood over it, swinging a censer and chanting the rite of purity, trying to banish any lingering taint. The smell of incense mixed with the stink of death in a nauseating cocktail. Engineer Holdstadt arrived on scene in a flurry of red robes, his entourage of servo skulls and Qatari servitors in tow. He surveyed the damage with an impassive augmented gaze. When he saw me, he stepped over metal tipstaff clicking on the deck. Greasy, tone measured, but with a tightness underlying it. Report. I struggled to my feet, clutching my bandaged arm. Field failure, sir. Brief but critical. Possibly a surge from the warp drives or a power conduit overload. I managed to root power and restabilize. We only dropped for a second, maybe less. I trailed off, glancing at where the demon had been. But enough. Holdstadt's jaw, the one part of his face not mechanized, clenched. Enough indeed. He looked at the scorched corridor, the blood splatters, the blackened craters from gunfire. For a moment, just a flicker, I thought I saw real concern in his remaining human eye. The Omniseer tests us with this anomaly. He turned abruptly to one of his adepts. Initiate secondary diagnostic rituals on every Gellar node and the primary generator. I want a full report within 2 hours. No detail overlooked. Go. The adepts scurred away, chanting, Binary can't, as they went. Holstad then fixed me with a stern look. Green, you'll assist me and get that arm properly seated too. You're bleeding on the floor. I nodded hurriedly. Yes. Ensia. My voice was coming back, though I felt a bit elated as the adrenaline ebbed. A proper medic would have to fix me up later, but I could still work for now. As Holstad moved off, presumably to oversee the diagnostics personally, I dared to speak quietly. Sir, any idea what caused this? We were running stable. He paused and lowered his voice, making sure others were out of earshot. Preliminary coitator analysis indicates a sudden spike in warp turbulence. The navigator reports an unexpected surge in the warp currents, something akin to a ripple from a distant storm. It may have temporarily overwhelmed the field's capacity. A distant storm. It sounded plausible, but something in his tone unsettled me. It was as if he was reciting a line he only half believed. Holstad went on briskly. We will verify all systems. In the meantime, keep this incident contained. The last thing we need is crew panic. They will be told we encountered a rogue warp swell and repelled a minor incursion. Nothing more. I managed a weak laugh, incredulous. Minor, right? Holstad's bionic eye word as it focused sharply on me. Green, mind yourself. You did well to react, but I need you sharp, not shaking with fear or cracking jokes. Understood. I straightened. Understood, sir. He nodded. The machine spirit held. We are alive. That is all that matters now. Resume your duties. The Emperor protects and the Omniseer guides. With that brusque pep talk, he swept away to supervise the adepts. I was left standing there, the blood of my fellow crew still cooling at my feet, wondering if that was truly all that mattered. 1 second of failure, 1 Emperor damned second, and we'd lost good men and come face to face with literal nightmares. How many more anomalies could we survive? As I helped the others scrub the corridor clean and repair what we could, a weight settled in my gut. Something felt off. Holstad's explanation made sense on the surface, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Perhaps it was the look in his eye, or just my own paranoia. But a questioning was this truly an unforeseeable warp surge? Or had something gone wrong with our beloved Gellar field that we weren't admitting? I vowed then and there to keep a close watch. For the sake of everyone aboard, I prayed Holstad was right, that this was a one-off accident, because the alternative was far worse, that our shield
against the abyss had a flaw, one we might not fix before the next time. In the wake of the incursion, the sanguine stars settled into an uneasy quiet. The captain kept the ship at high alert for the next 24 hours, but we did not drop out of warp. I learned through the grapevine that the navigator had considered an emergency translation back to real space after the attack, but given the situation was contained and our position in the warp uncertain, the decision was made to press on toward our destination. We were too far into the void to turn back without potentially getting lost longer, or so the officers reckoned. So we sailed forward deeper into the Inmaterium, praying that lightning wouldn't strike twice. The official notice to the crew was a minor warp entity had breached but was destroyed. Casualties were minimal, and the Emperor's protection held firm. Minimal casualties. Tell that to the families of the 4 crewmen who were torn apart. But I suppose from the Navy's cold perspective, it was minimal. Could have been the whole ship. Regardless, tension hung thick as fog. Every corridor I walked, I saw eyes darting to dark corners, hands trembling as they carried out duties. The whispers in the mess halls now were of fear, not idle gossip. My own nerves were shot, but I had no luxury of rest. Enginal drove us relentlessly to inspect and re-inspect every part of the Gellarfield array. I spent long hours in the guts of the system, doing everything short of praying for the machine's soul, and I did a fair bit of that too, just in case. We changed out a dozen components on H. Hallstatt's orders, even if they showed only the slightest singe or wear. Capacitors, conduits, coolant regulators, anything that looked at me funny got replaced or reactified. Yet for all that furious maintenance, an uneasy question kept nagging me. Why had the field flickered at all? Hallstatt's explanation of a warp turbulence made sense. Except it didn't entirely. Our ship wasn't new, but she'd weathered warp storms before. A mere ripple shouldn't have punched through our shield so catastrophically. And something about the timing, the suddenness of it. The more I thought, the more it gnawed at me that perhaps there was another factor, something we'd missed. After a double shift of labor and ritual, Hallstatt finally released me to rest. Instead of collapsing into my bunk, I found myself wandering to the infirmary, where they had taken Lauron. My arm, freshly stitched and wrapped, throbbed in pain, but I ignored it. I think I just didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. The infirmary was a cramped medbay on deck 10, filled with the antiseptic smell of synth gel and a lingering coppery tang of blood. I found Lauron lying on a cot propped up by pillows. He looked pale, a nasty bruise on his temple, and his right arm in a sling, but he flashed me a tired grin as I approached. "Well, if it isn't hero of the hour," he drawled softly. I grimaced. "Don't start. How are you holding up?" "Been worse," he said, though the strain in his voice told otherwise. "Medkey says I've got 2 cracked ribs and a mild concussion. They dosed me with something nice, so I'm just enjoying the ride." He gave a loopy half-smile, likely courtesy of the painkillers. I pulled a stool over and sat beside his cot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The curtain was drawn, giving us a bit of privacy from the groans of other injured crew elsewhere in the bay. Lauron broke the silence first, voice lower and more serious. "4 dead on my team," he said quietly. "One of them I played cards with just last week. Emperor's mercy. What a mess." I lowered my head. "I'm sorry, Lauron. If I'd noticed something off sooner, maybe." "Stop right there." He fixed me with a stern look, then winced as it pulled at his bruises. "You did more than anyone could have asked. You saved my damn life. Others too, probably. Getting that field back up." He shifted gingerly, adjusting the sling on his arm. "The bastard caught us off guard. That's all. Not your fault. The only thing to blame is that hell-spawned thing." I nodded, though guilt still churned in my gut. They always tell us how rare that is. Something actually getting through. I almost didn't believe it could happen until it did. Lauron was quiet a moment, then asked,
Any idea how it happened? I mean, isn't the whole point of that gadget of yours to keep those things out? I sighed and rubbed my face with my good hand. It is, and it's supposed to be fail. Honestly, I don't know. Official line is a warp surge overwhelmed us briefly. Maybe that's all it was. But what? I glanced around to make sure no attendants were nearby, then leaned in and whispered, "It doesn't add up. I keep thinking there's something more. Some kind of malfunction or Emperor forbid sabotage." Laurent's brow furrowed. Sabotage? You think someone wanted this to happen? His voice hardened, quiet anger underlying it. The idea of an enemy within is one any armsman takes personally. "I don't know," I said quickly. "It might sound paranoid, but something is scratching at me, telling me that wasn't just bad luck. I've been going over the system in my head. A sudden loss of field like that. It could be caused by a technical fault, or if someone tampered with a key component at just the wrong moment." Laurent considered, then nodded grimly. "We did pick up a few whispers in security. One of the lads swore he saw a shadow in the engine halls right before the alarms went off. Thought it was just a tech running by. Could have been nothing, but he trailed off, working through the implications just as I had. I haven't exactly broadcast my hunch," I continued. "Holstat is chalking it up to warp turbulence, and leaving it at that. Can't say I blame him. Thinking of an enemy agent or a cult on board is not something he'd want to face without proof. But if there is something to find, Emperor knows he's looking. He's thorough." Laurent made a face, sympathetic, but skeptical. "The engine seer is a hard bastard, but I've never thought him dishonest. Think he'd tell you if he suspected foul play." I shrugged. Maybe not. The mechanicists like to solve their own mysteries internally. He'd be duty-bound to report sabotage to the captain, but only when he's absolutely certain. Meanwhile, if I bring it up without proof, it could step on some cog toes. Laurent smirked despite himself. "We wouldn't want to anger the cogs." I let out a soft chuckle. In the gloom of the last days, even gallows humor was welcome. "No, we wouldn't." He reached out and put his good hand on my shoulder. "Marcus, be careful. If someone did cause this, they've already shown they don't care who they kill. Emperor forbid if you sniff them out, they might target you next. Don't go playing spook without backup." "All right, I won't." In truth, I felt like a corkscrew of anxiety had lodged in my brain. I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I either found something or convinced myself it truly was just an accident. I left Laurent to his rest soon after, assuring him I'd keep him updated and that I'd watch my back. I think we both felt a little better having talked, but I also saw the fear in his eyes. Fear of another breach, of a threat he couldn't fight with brute force alone. I shared that fear, but I also had a thread of determination. Now, if there was a traitor or a flaw, I'd find it. Back at my quarters, I finally slept in fitful snatches over the next few off-duty hours. No dreams that I remember, thank the Emperor, just a dark, heavy exhaustion. When I woke, if you can call it waking, I had a plan of sorts. First, inspect the hardware itself. Holstat had assigned me to replace a particular coupling in the Gellar field generator that had blown out during the incident. I'd done so in the flurry of repairs, but I'd kept the scorched component for closer study. A habit of mine, truth be told. If something fails, I like to know why. I retrieved the burnt-out coupling from my tool locker. It was a cylinder the size of a forearm, now blackened and cracked. Setting it on my bench under the glow of a task lamp, I began to carefully pry it open with a screwdriver and some small pliers, the way a Chugujin might open a skull. The inside was a mess of fused circuitry. I muttered to myself as I examined each little section. Machine spirit, show me what ails you. It looked like a classic overload burnout, nothing unusual at first glance, but as I prodded, a chunk of the carbonized wiring fell away, revealing something lodged deep in the assembly that clearly didn't belong. My breath caught. I took a pair of tweezers and gingerly extracted the foreign object. It was a sliver of metal, no larger than a fingernail. I held it up to the light. Thin, curved, almost like a fragment of a blade or needle. No, this looked deliberate. A tiny shard of circuitry, with a hair-fine filament trailing from it. I frowned and set it down on a white cloth for contrast. That definitely wasn't part of the standard coupling design. Could it be debris that got in during the explosion? Perhaps the coupling shattered, and this is just a piece of it. But the outer casing was intact aside from surface burns. This shard had to have been introduced from outside. I took a diagnostic off-specs out of my kit and passed its sensor over the shard, humming softly as it read. The device pinged and displayed a string of data. Most of it was nonsense to me. Machine spirits speak in riddles, but one thing was clear. The fragment was picking up and emitting an electromagnetic signal at a specific frequency. My eyes widened as the op-specs traced the output. This thing was designed to resonate at precisely the field frequency of our Gellar generator. In plain terms, it was a disruptor, a tiny, cleverly constructed disruptor that, if placed inside the coupling, could introduce just enough harmonic discord to cause a flicker. I felt my mouth go dry. This was it, proof that someone had sabotaged the field. That surge might not have been a random warp turbulence at all, but a manufactured event. A surge of triumph and dread hit me in equal measure. On one hand, I had vindication of my instincts. On the other, it meant we truly had an enemy on board right here among us. I quickly wrapped the shard in the cloth and tucked it into a pocket inside my coveralls. I didn't know who I could fully trust with this yet. Holt. If he was innocent, he needed to know immediately, but a cautious voice in my mind urged restraint. I still had no idea who was behind it. If I went straight to the chief engineer and Emperor forbid he or one of his inner Adepts was involved, I'd be signing my own death warrant, or they destroy the evidence. Claim I planted it out of delirium. My thoughts raced. Lauren was out of commission for at least a day, but maybe I could quietly inform the ship's commissar or the confessor. They would take any whisper of heresy or sabotage deadly seriously. Yet going to them without more concrete information, likely Hallstatt's first question would be how I found it, and why I suspected to look in the first place. It might not be enough to accuse someone yet. No, I needed a clearer picture. If there was one planted device, there could be others, and whoever placed it had to have had access to the generator or its components. That narrowed the suspects. Tech priests, tech adepts, possibly engineering crew. But the field generators were off limits to unaugmented personnel without a mechanicus escort. I thought of Yari, the junior tech priestess who'd been with me before the jump. Could she have done it? She was there earlier with incense, but during the incident, she wasn't with me. She was elsewhere, presumably assisting Holto. My gut doubted it was her. She was as devout to the Messiah as any. Sabotage would be ultimate blasphemy to a true mechanicus devote. Who then? One of Hallstatt's inner circle, or Emperor forbid Hallstatt himself? My stomach churned at that thought. No, it couldn't be him. He fought tooth and nail to restore the field, risking his own life in the process, didn't he? Actually, I realized I hadn't seen Hallstatt during the thick of the fight at all. He'd arrived after once things were safe. But that wasn't damning. He could have been coordinating from the engine command. Still, I recalled how quick he was to declare it a warp surge and move on. Had he truly looked concerned, or just acting concerned? Damn it, paranoia was getting to me. I resolved to investigate quietly a bit further before deciding my next move. I would inspect
generator chamber itself, perhaps under the guise of triple-checking the systems to see if any other anomalies were present, maybe even review the maintenance logs around the time of the incident for any unusual activity. Replacing the disassembled coupling into my locker, I sealed it and headed out, wincing as I flexed my injured arm. The corridor beyond my quarters was dim. Shipboard night cycle. Minimal crew patrolling. Perfect. I made my way toward the main generator chamber, keeping my footfalls soft on the metal decking. As I approached the heavy adamantium doors leading into the Gellar field generator sanctum, I slowed. Normally, 2 servitor sentries were stationed here around the clock. Odd tonight, only one was present, its half-mechanical corpse frame idling silently, eyes dull. Perhaps the other was removed for maintenance or retasked elsewhere after the incident. It gave me an eerie feeling, as if the usual safeguards were being thinned. The servitor didn't react to my presence beyond a cursory scan of my eye to end tag. The doors unlocked for me, with a clunk of mag seals. I stepped inside, the familiar incense-tinged air wrapping around me. It was dark, lit only by the glow of rune panels and the faint blue corona emanating from the central generator core. The chamber was vast and vaulted, housing the primary machinery that protected us from damnation. That normally comforting hum was present, steady and strong. I moved slowly down the grated walkway, eyes scanning for anything out of place. All seemed as I'd left it earlier. Cables neatly secured, coolant mist curling along the floor, devotional parchments fluttering gently in the recycled airflow. I passed one of the skull sensors still hanging, where Yari left it, its incense long burnt out. Halfway to the main console, I froze. There was a faint light bobbing on the far side of the generator, partially obscured by the massive coils. It looked like the beam of a handheld lumen. My pulse quickened. No one was supposed to be here at this hour, aside from perhaps an assigned tech adept, and I hadn't seen anyone when I came in. I quietly ducked behind a support pillar and watched. The silhouette of a hooded figure passed in front of the light, briefly outlined against the glow of the generator. They seemed to be inspecting something on the floor, then stood up and moved with purpose along the peripheral railing. In the stillness, I could just make out the soft clank of metal on metal, augment footsteps. A tech priest for sure. I strained my eyes. The figure's robes were dark, not easily identifiable as any specific person at this distance. They paused by an array of conduits and bent down again. Doing Emperor. Knew what were they planting another device, checking on one. My mouth went dry. I decided I couldn't just crouch and watch. Not if they were compromising our ship further. Not if lives were at stake. Clutching a small wrench from my belt, my makeshift weapon of choice, it seemed, I stepped out, calling across the chamber. Who's there? Identify yourself.
My voice echoed startlingly loud in the cavernous room. The figure snapped upright, lumens swinging toward me. I caught a glint of metal, possibly the shine of bionic eyes. They said nothing, but I felt a tension in the air, as if a predator had just spotted prey. Tech Adept Grim Gellarfield Maintenance, I announced, trying to keep my voice firm. This area is restricted. State your designation and purpose. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw them start to raise a hand as if caught and placating. But then that hand darted to their side, and I glimpsed a sudden spark, a muzzle flash. A supersonic crack split the air. Something whizzed past my ear and chipped the pillar behind me with a burst of sparks. Holy throne! They were shooting at me. Instinct took over. I ducked and rolled behind the coil housing as a second gunshot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the metal with a high-pitched ping. My heart thundered. The figure had a firearm. No tech priest had any reason to carry a projectile weapon, unless they really didn't want to be identified. Traitorous filth, I shouted, anger momentarily overriding fear. So it was true. Someone was deliberately sabotaging us, and now they were trying to kill me for discovering it. My mind flashed to Lauren's warning to watch my back. Too late for that. I crawled along the floor behind cover as another shot rang out. Then another. I counted 3, 4. The retorts were deafening in the enclosed space, leaving my ears ringing. He's trying to keep me pinned, I realized. Wrench in hand, I peeked around the corner for half a second. I saw the muzzle flare and ducked back just as a bullet slammed into the wall, showering me with hot flecks of metal. But I caught a partial glimpse. Robes, the glint of a chrome skull, implant on the face. Emperor, I knew that augment skull piece. Whole state, I gasped under my breath. Disbelief hit me like a blow. It had to be him. Angenseer Prime Whole State had a distinctive silver cranial augmentic that covered half his face, fashioned in the likeness of a skull. In the split-second illumination of the gunfire, I'd seen it. I wasn't 100% certain, but everything now made horrible sense. The chief engine seer of our ship was shooting at me. A cold wave of shock and betrayal fought with the adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't have the luxury to process it. I needed to get out of there alive and warn the others. Silence fell for a moment. Through the ringing in my ears, I thought I heard the
rapid clank of footsteps on a ladder.
Hole 2 retreating toward a secondary exit, perhaps. Holding my breath, I risked another look. The chamber was empty, save for the gently humming machines and drifting haze. He was gone. I sank against the coil, wrench clutched tight, my mind racing. Emperor's Grace, Whole State, the one overseeing our safety, was the saboteur, the heretic. It made my stomach turn. But why? Had he gone mad, turned to worship of the ruinous powers, or coerced somehow? I had so many questions, and no time for answers. I realized with dread that if Whole State was truly a traitor, he wouldn't be working alone. And if he knew I was onto him, he'd act fast to finish whatever heinous plan he'd begun. Likely he'd try to finish me as well, if he could. I needed help. Now my first instinct was to vox security, raise the alarm. Whole State might have ears on the channel, but at this point, it hardly mattered. I thumbed my vox bead to the general security frequency and shouted, "Security, respond. Ingenal is the saboteur. He sabotaged the Gellar field. I repeat, Whole State is a traitor, heading to the Gellar generator." Only static answered at first. then a burst of garbled voices and screams. I thought I heard someone acknowledge, before the feed dissolved into howling distortion. At least I'd tried. I could only pray someone heard me. With no time to waste, I broke into a sprint. The best course was to run, get to Lauren, or the commissar in person, and tell them everything. Evidence or no evidence, an engineer trying to murder me, and the Gellar field failing catastrophically, would be proof enough that something was rotten aboard. As I bolted from the chamber, heart in my throat, I felt the ship shudder again. A deep groan reverberated through the hull. For a split second, I feared Holstate had done something else to the field, but the lights remained steady. This felt different, like a distant impact, or a translation. I skidded to a halt in the passage outside the sanctum as the realization hit. The warp drive had just disengaged. A lurch not as violent as a normal translation, but noticeable. Were we dropping out of the warp? An emergency drop? Did the captain order that? My mind spun. Dropping out of the warp suddenly can be catastrophic for navigation and leave us stranded. But maybe another crisis forced it. Or maybe Holstate triggered some fail-safe or sabotage of the warp engines. I didn't know. The whole lighting flickered, then shifted from dim to a harsh alert red. A new alarm began to wail, adding to my panic. Not the same klaxon as before. This was a broader ship emergency tone. The ship's vox speakers crackled to life with the panicked voice of an officer. All hands. General emergency. Gellar field is down. I repeat, Gellar field is. The voice cut off in a strangled yelp. Ice flooded my veins. The Gellar field was down. Not flickering, not weak. Down completely. Holstate must have done it. Throne of terror. He must have shut it off somehow, or sabotaged it beyond repair, in those moments after he fled. Perhaps our navigator, or cogitators, had automatically yanked us back to real space as a last-ditch safety measure. But if the alarm was still blaring, it meant the field hadn't come back up. Whether we were fully in real space or still partially in the warp, we were now effectively defenseless. All around, I could feel it like the air suddenly turned razor-sharp and heavy with malice. That latent pressure you always sense during warp travel was now unleashed in full. We had been cast adrift in two realities, maybe halfway out of the warp, maybe not at all, but certainly open to whatever waited beyond our bubble. A scream echoed down the corridor, then another from somewhere above. Many screams. My worst nightmare was unfolding, and this time, I knew I wasn't dreaming. Pandemonium, pure and absolute pandemonium, consumed the ship. As I raced through the corridors toward the Engineerium, the wailing of alarms and the shrieks of the damned blended into a cacophony of terror. The red emergency illuminators flickered, casting frantic shadows that seemed to leap and lunge at the edges of my vision. It felt as if the sanguine stars herself was screaming. I rounded a corner and nearly collided with a group of ratings running the opposite direction, eyes wide and wild. One of them, a young woman with a nasty gash across her face, grabbed my arm in passing, her nails biting through my coverall. "Don't go that way," she sobbed, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "They're everywhere. Emperor, protect us. They're everywhere." Another crewman pulled her along without even slowing, desperate to flee whatever horror they'd seen. I swallowed hard, forcing myself forward against the tide of panicked crew. The direction they were fleeing from was exactly where I needed to go, deeper toward the engineering decks and the primary Gellar generator. If we had any hope at all, clutched the cloth-wrapped disruptor shard in my pocket as a talisman of purpose. Holstein did this. He planned this. I turned another passageway, and my boots slid in something slick. Blood. Emperor, save me. An entire corridor section was smeared with gore. Half a dozen figures littered the deck in pieces, as if torn apart by wild animals. The bulkhead walls themselves were dented, and claw-marked as though something had tried to force its way through by sheer brute strength. Amid the carnage, something moved. Two somethings. They looked vaguely like men at first, until one turned and I saw its face. A grotesque lamprey-like maw, where a human mouth should be filled with rotating rings of fangs. The other creature had quills or spines bristling from its forearms and back. Both were clad in the shredded remnants of Imperial crew uniforms. Emperor had those once been men twisted, mutated beyond all recognition by the warp. They were hunched over a corpse feeding with slavering enthusiasm. As my boots squeaked in the pulled blood, they snapped their heads up, black vacant eyes fixed on me, and in unison they let out a wet, hissing shriek. I did not hesitate. With a surge of adrenaline, I raised the last pistol I'd taken from a dead armsman and fired. The red bolt sizzled through the air, catching the lead abomination in the chest. It burned a fist-sized hole straight through it, and the thing collapsed with a choking gurgle. The second one was nearly upon me. I fired again point blank. My first shot went wide, scorching the bulkhead. Before I could correct, it sprang, knocking me backward. We hit the deck hard, my breath whooshing out as its weight bore down. Clawed hands scrabbled for my throat. I got my forearm up just in time, and its slavering maw clamped on my sleeve, teeth soaring through the fabric inches from my flesh. I screamed in desperate fury and jammed
Last pistol under its chin. With a pull of the trigger, its head vanished in a flash of superheated steam and burning eye core. The headless corpse slumped atop me, twitching, gasping. I heaved the thing off and staggered to my feet. Blood, not mine, thankfully, dripping from my face and arms. My hands were shaking violently, but I couldn't afford to stop now. I spared barely a glance for the poor souls whose remains painted the corridor. I'd mourn later if I lived. The encounter had cost me precious time and filled me with a nauseating dread. If even ordinary voidsmen were turning into warp-spawned horrors, our situation was beyond dire. For all I knew, the entire ship was already lost. But some obstinate spark in me refused to surrender. Not yet. I pressed on, now armed. The last pestle felt reassuring in my grip, a small comfort amid the insanity. The closer I got to the Inmaterium, the hotter the air became, and the more twisted the ship's layout seemed. Corridors that should have been familiar took on Ancha-like wrongness, doors appearing where they shouldn't, passages stretching longer than their physical length. I nearly stumbled as reality flickered. At one intersection, I was certain I saw a familiar figure standing in a side corridor. A woman in a simple habdress, arm outstretched in a comforting gesture. My mother looking as she did in my childhood memories. She smiled and beckoned to me, my heart wrenched in confusion. My mother has been dead for years. I blinked, and in that blink the figure melted away, replaced by a hunched paladin peering at me, with gleaming eyes from the ceiling. I swore and shook my head, willing the hallucination away. The warp was toying with my mind, searching for any crack in my sanity to exploit. I nearly fell down a flight of metal stairs that hadn't existed before. Warp reality was bleeding into the ship, warping our precious metal womb into a labyrinth of madness. I had to navigate carefully now, Some corridors looped back on themselves, or led to dead ends where there should have been passage. The ship's machine spirit itself seemed confused, doors opening and closing at random, as if unsure of the proper configuration. All the while, distant gunfire and muffled explosions rattled through the hall. At one junction, I came across a cluster of crewmen, huddled behind an overturned metal bench firing down an adjacent hallway. "Come on, hold the line," a voice was shouting. Commissar Altman, by the sound of that drill sergeant bellow. I risked a glance to see him, and a handful of naval armsmen pouring last fire at something out of my line of sight. As I slipped by the intersection, I caught a glimpse of what they faced. An undulating mass of fleshy tendrils filling the corridor like a sea of living entrails, shrugging off bullets as it crept forward. The commissar bolt pistol barked, blasting fist-sized chunks off it, but the thing kept coming relentlessly. I offered a silent prayer for their souls and kept running. I had my own mission to attend and no firepower to help with that nightmare. The last I heard was the commissar reciting the litany of hate at full volume. As the tendrils closed in down one deck, then two, I was getting close. The Inmaterium and Gellar generator lay just ahead through a large antechamber. The closer I got, the more the ship itself groaned and trembled. Dull bangs reverberated, possibly secondary explosions, or entire compartments being vented to flush out intruders. The emergency bulkheads were slamming shut and opened seemingly at random. Our systems failing under the warp's onslaught, I had to pry one half-closed hatch open with brute force to squeeze through, tearing a gash in my shoulder in the process. I barely felt it. As I stumbled into the entry vestibule outside the generator chamber, the ship lurched violently once more. Gravity flickered. I was lifted off my feet for a heartbeat as everything felt weightless, then slammed back to the deck plating. As the grav generators reasserted themselves, I bit back a cry as pain from my various wounds jolted through me. Something huge must have happened. Maybe the navigator had managed a full emergency translation into real space. Or perhaps something had struck us. I couldn't know, and it didn't matter now. What mattered was that we were open to the warp, and the field was down. The door to the generator sanctum was ahead. It stood ajar, light spilling out into the corridor in fitful flashes. As I approached, panting and bleeding, I heard a sound that made my blood boil. Chanting. Human voices raised in some kind of ritual punctuated by metallic bangs and inhuman screeches. I crept to the doorway and peered in. What I saw nearly made me gag with fury and horror. The generator chamber had been defiled. Symbols of chaos were daubed across the floor and walls in blood glowing dully in the red emergency lights. Incense braziers had been overturned or relit with corpse fat candles filling the air with a cloying, nauseating sweet smell. And scattered around the central generator core were a half-dozen figures in tattered navy uniforms on their knees, or hunched in obscene prayer. Cultists. There was no other word. These must have been members of the crew, now revealing their true allegiance amid the chaos. At the heart of them stood Ingenser Halstead. He was flanked by two tech adepts I recognized, both of whom now had their hoods thrown back to reveal strange brands on their shaved scalps. The eight-pointed star of chaos. Halstead himself had shed the pretense of loyal Mechanicus. His red robes were torn open to the waist, revealing emaciated flesh covered in painted sigils and script that hurt the eyes to read. His augment eye glowed with an unnatural hue, and his once measured voice had risen to a manic exalted timbre as he led the chanting.
I squinted through the haze. Hallstatt was holding something aloft in his hands, some kind of device wired directly into the generator's control console. It was pulsing with a sickly green light. Even from across the chamber, I recognized it. A larger, more complex version of the disruptor shard I'd found. Wires snaked from it into the open panels of the Gellar field generator, and the machine was emitting a kinning whine like a distressed animal. That must be what was keeping the field offline even after our emergency translation. Hallstatt's voice rang out in high Gothic, dripping with fervor. O mighty scenes of the void, ravenous ones beyond the veil, your path is clear. This vessel is yours, an offering of blood and souls. Come forth and claim your prize. Feast, and through our service, let us be reborn in your image. His acolytes responded with a fervent howl, banging tools against the deck in a rhythmic clang. My heart plummeted. Hallstatt wasn't just sabotaging the ship, he was inviting the warp in, summoning it deliberately. All this death and horror orchestrated for some insane promise of power or rebirth. Above Hallstatt, swirling in the thick incense smoke and shimmering warp light, I saw a distortion. A vaguely humanoid outline coalesced in sickly purple fire, swelling into a towering monstrosity. Something was coming through, something much larger than the demon I'd faced earlier. The air around it warped with malevolence. A greater demon, perhaps. An apex horror from the Inmaterium. It loomed at least 3 times the height of a man with a crown of twisting horn-like projections and eyes that burned like emerald suns. The very sight of its half-formed visage made my teeth ache and my vision swim. It wasn't fully here yet, but each passing second of the field being down gave it strength. The sight galvanized me. No matter what happened to me personally, I could not let that thing fully manifest. If a greater demon boarded the sanguine stars, that would be the end of everyone on board, and perhaps countless others beyond if it wasn't stopped. I slid my last bestow out, wiping my sweaty palm on my coverall. If I could take out Hallstatt, or that device he was holding, maybe I could stop this. The cultists were largely fixated on their ritual, backs turned or eyes closed in ecstasy at the rising warp energies. Hallstatt stepped away from the console, arms raised toward the half-formed entity above, as if in supplication. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to take aim. A single shot to the head might end this betrayal for good. Emperor, guide my hand. Before I could squeeze the trigger, a roar echoed from behind me. Suffer not the heretic to live. A hail of gunfire erupted into the chamber. I ducked reflexively as bullets whizzed past overhead. I glanced back to see a squad of Navy armsmen spilling into the doorway behind me, weapons blazing. At their head limped Father Carpus, his once white robes torn and bloody, holding a bolt pistol and firing with righteous fury. The cultists were caught completely off guard. 2 of them went down immediately in sprays of blood as the armsmen's initial volley found marks. The others scrambled for cover or fell flat, their ritual forgotten. Hallstatt shrieked in rage or pain. One of the shots must have grazed him because I saw blood dripping from his left arm. Itwekt sup, bulls and trek to me is derp. The half-formed warp entity above him writhed in agitation, its attempt to manifest destabilizing without the steady chant. Hallstatt screeched, "No, destroy them, my brothers. Slay the unbelievers. Finish the ritual." With unnatural speed belying his age, Hallstatt ducked behind the generator console. His mechandrite lashed out, yanking one of his wounded acolytes to use as a living shield. In his other hand, he suddenly wielded a weapon. I caught the gleam of it, and my stomach turned. It was a Volkite Serpenta, an archaic and devastating pistol, likely scavenged from some tech vault. Of course, Hallstatt had kept a dark secret like that up his sleeve. I pressed myself against a support column as Hallstatt opened fire. A searing beam lanced out, vaporizing one of the armsmen into ash instantly. The other armsman kept shooting, but Hallstatt had cover and the element of surprise. Another Volkite blast caught a sailor in the chest. He dropped with a hole burned clean through him. Father Carpus advanced, bellowing the litany of fury, trying to draw fire. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him take cover behind a fallen piece of plating, trading shots with one of the cultists, who had recovered enough to return fire with a looted shotgun. The chamber had become a war zone, echoing with gunshots, screams, and the guttural snarls of the frustrated warp creature above. The demon's form was flickering, unable to fully manifest amid the disruption. I realized the cult's concentration was broken. The summoning wasn't complete yet. There was still time to stop it entirely, but we had to act fast. I remembered the device. Hallstatt's custom disruptor was still wired into the generator console, humming and pulsing with warp energy. That was the keystone of this nightmare. If I could disable or destroy it, the Gellar field might reboot and shove that thing back into the abyss where it belonged. Keeping low, I sprinted from my spot behind the column toward the console. One cultist lunged at me from the shadows with a jagged piece of metal, screaming praise to the dark gods. I sidestepped his wild swing, my still numb wounded arm failing me as I tried to raise the pistol. So I resorted to brutality, slamming the butt of the lost pistol into his face. His nose crunched and he collapsed with a gargled curse. I slid the last few meters to the console on my knees. The disruptor device was right there, crudely wired into the generator's sacred circuitry. Its little rune screen flickered with streams of code. The scrap code that was keeping the Gellar field offline, no doubt. Without hesitation, I grabbed a fistful of cables and began tearing them free. Holy sparks flew, and I got a nasty shock that burned my already injured hand. But I kept yanking like a madman. Another cable ripped loose, and the device sputtered. Above me, a thunderous crack resounded. Hallstatt firing that Volkite weapon again. I smelled ozone and saw a chunk of wall blow apart in a shower of sparks behind me. He had spotted me. Green, you worm. Hallstatt's voice was distorted with rage, amplified by his vox implants into a metallic snarl. Do not touch that, or I will flick you alive. I gritted my teeth and pulled the final cluster,
but wires with all my strength. The disruptor device popped and fizzled, its lights dying. I tossed it aside and slammed my fist onto the manual reset rune on the console. Come on, come on. I prayed aloud for an agonizing second. Nothing happened. Then the generator deep beneath my feet gave a healthy thrum. A familiar vibration coursed through the deck. On the console, green runes flickered to life. The Gellar field was reactivating. No, Hallstatt's scream was inhuman. I risked a look up. The half-formed demon above writhed and shrieked as a wash of golden light swept through the chamber. The Gellar field's re-established presence like sunshine, cutting through fall. The creature's outline began to thin and fray, with a sound like tearing metal. It was yanked back into the Inmaterium, disappearing in a flash of sickly light and a thunderclap of displaced air. A wave of pressure knocked many of us off our feet as reality reasserted itself. The ritual was broken. The summoning failed. Sweet relief flooded me. We weren't out of the woods, not by far. But that was one disaster averted. Holstadt, however, was not about to surrender his insane plan. With a snarl, he vaulted over a railing, landing on the deck with a heavy thud of mag boots. His hood had fallen back, exposing his gaunt, rage-twisted face. "You wretched, faithless dog," he howled at me. "You've ruined everything." He leveled his Volkite pistol at me just as I scrambled behind the console for cover. The ancient weapon spat, blowing a molten chunk out of the console housing an inch from my head. I felt a wash of heat singe my hair. Before Holstadt could fire again, Father Carpus emerged from the smoke behind him. "Blasphemer," the confessor roared, swinging his gilded chains in a broad arc. Caught off guard, Holstadt barely managed to interpose his mechadendrite. The whirring blade clashed against metal tentacles, sparking. Carpus pressed, eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Your heresy dies here, Holstadt." For a moment it looked like the old priest might just take him, but Holstadt was fighting with more than mortal strength now. Perhaps the dark powers he served lent him vigor. He parried a downward slash, then lunged with surprising agility, driving the smoking barrel of his Volkite into the confessor's gut and pulling the trigger. Carpus convulsed as superheated energy punched through him. With a shocked wheeze, he collapsed to his knees, a smoking hole in his midsection. Holstadt backhanded him with a cybernetic arm, sending the mortally wounded priest sprawling and clearing his path to me. I raised my last pistol and fired wildly. One shot hit Holstadt's shoulder, burning a hole through his robe and eliciting a grunt of pain, but he kept coming. Another shot pinged off a chest plate beneath his robes. He must have been wearing some light armor. In the smoky gloom, his augmentic eye glowed like a demon's as he closed the distance. I scrambled back, trying to find better cover or an escape route, but Holstadt was too fast. With a snarl, his mechadendrite shot forward and coiled around my throat, lifting me clean off the ground. I gagged, kicking my feet uselessly as he carried me, slamming my back against a support pillar. My last pistol slipped from my grasp, clattering to the deck. Holstadt loomed close, face contorted with triumph and hatred. Holt foul breath washed over me as he spoke in a low, venomous hiss. "You could have been part of the new order, Marcus. I would have shown you wonders beyond imagining," he snarled. "Instead, you cling to the corpse god and his pathetic trinkets." I clawed at the metal tendril constricting my neck, vision starting to blur. "Holstadt, please," I choked out, not even sure what I was begging for. "Mercy, reason, something." His human eye was wide and crazed, the veins around it bulging. "Look around you," he spat. "This is inevitable. Humanity's ascension lies in the warp, not in denying it. The dark gods will remake us into perfection. The false emperor would keep us weak and blind, but I will be as a god of knowledge." Spittle flew from his lips. He was utterly lost to madness. Blackness crept at the edges of my vision. My lungs burned, desperate for air. My hands groped at my belt for anything. Weapon, tool, anything. My fingers brushed a cylinder, tucked in a side pocket. I didn't know what it was, but I seized it, swinging with all the feeble strength I had left. It was a small spanner, ironically. The metal tool cracked into the side of Holstadt's head, right against his augment eye. With a bright shower of sparks, the mechanical lens shattered. Holstadt howled in agony, dropping me as both his hands flew to his ruined implant. I crashed to the floor, coughing and retching, but I couldn't waste the chance. I forced myself to my hands and knees. Nearby,
Father Carpus' fallen bolt pistol gleamed under a shattered lumen. Holstadt recovered quickly, too quickly, blinded in one eye, face half burned. He still had fight in him. His mechandrite snaked out again, this time coiling around my ankle, yanking me away from the bolt pistol just as my fingers grazed it. He dragged me across the floor, my nails screeching on the metal as I tried to grab hold of something. "You insect," he bellowed, voice warbling between human and demonic tones. "If I die, I'll take you with me." I was flipped onto my back as he pulled me closer. I saw him raising his Volkite pistol with his left hand, aiming shakily at my face. Time seemed to slow. I knew I had seconds at most. My right hand brushed against something, the cloth-wrapped disruptor shard that had fallen from my pocket. In a final desperate move, I grabbed the shard and flung it at Holstadt's head. The jagged fragment struck his cheek, and he flinched, just a tiny reflex, but enough. His shot went wide, a Volkite beam searing past my ear. I didn't hesitate. I lunged forward, closing the last meter between us, and snatched Corpus' bolt pistol from the deck. Tart realized too late. I saw the fear in his remaining eye as I jammed the hefty barrel under his chin. "The Emperor protects." I snarled and pulled the trigger. The bolt round blew out the back of Holstadt's skull in a gout of fire and bone. For a heartbeat, his body remained upright, mechandrite swaying in confusion. Then, like a puppet with its strings cut, the heretic engine collapsed in a heap beside me, his augmented limbs clattering against the floor. The smell of burned flesh and ozone hung heavy in the air. I sat there, bolt pistol still clutched in my trembling hands, staring at Holstadt's corpse. It didn't feel like victory, just grim inevitability. Around me, the fighting had petered out. The surviving cultists, those that hadn't been cut down or blown apart, threw down their weapons and begged for mercy, now that their prophet was dead and the warp's favor had abandoned them. The armsmen moved among them, securing with cuffs or summary executions, depending on the level of resistance. I suspected none of these traitors would live to see another day regardless. I coughed, my throat raw and bruised. Each breath felt like swallowing glass, but I was alive. By the grace of the God Emperor, I was alive. The Gellar field was humming strong once more, a steady background reassurance that the immediate horror was contained. Whatever creatures hadn't been slaughtered were either in hiding or banished by the field's return. The ship was in ruins. Many were dead, but there were survivors, and we had stopped the disaster from going any further. Lauren, Emperor Lauren, my heart seized as I remembered my friend. I scrambled up, almost slipping on Holstadt's blood, and limped to where I'd seen Lauren last. He was slumped against a bulkhead at the edge of the chamber, an armsman kneeling over him. As I rushed up, the armsman looked at me and shook his head grimly. He stepped aside, and I saw why Lauren was dying. The entire left side of his torso was a charred mess from a Volkite hit. How he'd even dragged himself here was beyond comprehension. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and his breath came in shallow gasps. I dropped to my knees beside him. Lauren, his one good eye rolled to me. Hey Marcus," he croaked, faintly smiling. We get the fracker." I had to blink back tears. "Yeah, we got him. It's over." "Good, that's good." His head leaned back. Told you to watch. You're back," he wheezed, trying to chuckle, but devolving into a bloody cough. I took his hand. There was nothing of the medicine in me. I could only give comfort. "Just hold on. We're out of the warp now. Mediseki will be here any minute. You'll see." He squeezed my hand weakly, a sad knowing look in his eye. We both knew the truth. "Listen, He rasped about that drink I promised. Don't do that, I managed, my voice breaking. You can tell me all about it, planet-side over as many rounds as you want. He gave a slight shake of his head. Not this time, friend. His eyes grew distant for a moment. Do me a favor, find my mom on Ceres. Tell her I kept my faith. Yeah. A tear leaked from the corner of his eye, cutting through grime on his cheek. I nodded frantically, blinking my own tears away. I will, I promise. He seemed to relax a bit. Mission accomplished. The Emperor protects, he whispered, voice barely audible. I gripped his hand tight. The Emperor protects, I echoed softly. Lauren let out one last shuddering breath, then his gaze fixed on something beyond me. Perhaps something beyond this world entirely. His hand went limp in mine. I bowed my head over our joined hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. We had survived the nightmare, but so many good people had not. My friend among them. After a moment, I felt a gentle touch on my back. Through my tears, I saw Father Carpus leaning next to me, blood staining his robes. He was alive, though just barely. The medics were already fussing over him. Despite his grievous wound, the old confessor smiled peacefully. With a trembling hand, he traced the sign of the Aquila in Lauren's blood on the deck. He returns to the Emperor's light, Carpus said quietly. Mourn him but remember him with honor. I swallowed and nodded. The priest's words were a small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. We stayed there a moment, the confessor and I, offering a final prayer for Lauren's departing soul, even as the remaining cultists were led away in chains, and the cleanup crews moved in. At long last, the horror was over. It took days to fully secure the sanguine stars. We had indeed performed an emergency translation out of the warp, ending up adrift in the emptiness between systems, battered, but blessedly back in real space. A relief, though, in the grand calculus. It mattered little. Of our crew of 1,000 souls, barely 300 remained alive. The corridors were quiet now, save for the occasional echo of distant repair work, or the footfalls of patrolling armsmen, wary for any remaining threats. We sent astropathic distress calls once our choir recovered, those who survived anyway. Eventually, an Imperial Navy patrol responded, finding us and escorting our wounded ship to a nearby naval port for refit. The official report glossed over many details, but everyone on board knew the truth of what had happened, even if they wouldn't speak of it loudly. When we docked, the Inquisition quietly took over. They always do after incidents like this. Each of us who lived was subjected to rigorous purity tests, interrogations, mind scans, the whole ordeal. They needed to be sure none of the warp's stain lingered in our minds or bodies. I still shudder at the memory of their cold clinical scrutiny. The Inquisitor's steely eyes watching for the slightest twitch of guilt, the sanctioned psycher's presence slithering through my thoughts during the soul scouring, the Medicace priest tracing hexogic wards over my skin to reveal any hidden mutation. A part of me expected a bolt round to the back of the skull by the end of it just to be sure. Many times that's exactly what happens, but in the end they deemed us clean enough to spare. Angensia Hallstatt's heresy and the nightmare it caused will likely be sealed under a 100 levels of clearance, never to be spoken of in the light of day. The Navy will chalk up the casualties to a warp accident and quietly assign a new engine searer. Life in the Imperium goes on.
Consigned the bodies of the fallen to the void in a solemn ceremony. I stood among rows of grieving survivors in the hangar bay as we launched their coffins into the starless dark. I murmured the Emperor's prayer for each of them, for the innocent ratings, for Father Carpus's acolytes, for brave Lauren. My voice shook on his name. Their sacrifices recorded in the ship's lee and in our hearts would not be forgotten. As for me, I received a citation for extraordinary valor and devotion to duty, signed by the Sector Admiral himself. They even offered me a promotion, a chance to transfer off-ship if I wanted. I turned it down. I'm still here on the Sanguine Stars. She's been repaired, more or less enough to limp along until proper dockyards can restore her. We got a fresh coat of blessed paint over the scorched panels, new surfters to replace the ones that got mangled, and more incense than you can imagine to reconsecrate every corner. She's different now though, quieter, like she's mourning. Maybe that's just us projecting our grief, but I swear the machine spirit itself misses the crewmates we lost. We have a new engineer prime, Amaros from Mars, aloof and efficient. He doesn't talk to me much, which is fine. I prefer the quiet. I'll admit I find myself watching our new engineer and his acolytes with a hawk's gaze for any sign of treachery. Once you've seen the kind of rot that can hide behind a friendly face, it's hard to ever fully trust again. I spend most of my hours in the generator chamber, tuning the Gellar field, triple-checking every component a dozen times over. The new tech adepts think I'm obsessive. Maybe I am. I've looked into the abyss and seen it stare back, hungry. I'll be damned if I let it take us again. They say I've changed since that voyage, that I'm more solemn, distant. I suppose that's true. I left a part of myself in the warp, a part that will haunt me until the day I die. I still have nightmares. I see Hallstatt's face, half metal and half madness, lunging at me. I see Lauren smiling and then bleeding out in my arms. I hear the laughter of demons echoing in the engine hum at night. And yet I carry on, because someone has to. Because there are millions of souls who step aboard void ships each day, never knowing how thin the line is that separates them from hell. Someone has to keep that line intact. I'm just a Gellar field technician. One tiny cog in the great Imperial war machine. I'm not a hero by any stretch. I'm a scarred, sleep-deprived wreck who talks to his engine more than he talks to other people. But I'm alive. Emperor knows why. But I am out here at the edge of the abyss. That's the most anyone can hope for. And hope, however fragile, is something I'll cling to with every fiber of my being. After all, in the Imperium of man, hope and the Emperor's grace are what keep us from the unseen horrors of warp travel. And I've seen enough of those horrors for one lifetime. Gellar field holding steady at 100%. All systems nominal, I murmur, my voice echoing in the emptiness, a log entry made out of sheer habit. A ghost of a smile tugs at my face. Another jump survived. Another day alive. The Vox clicks off. The hum of the Gellar field is my only answer. A steady, loyal heartbeat in the gloom. Somewhere far above, beyond these metal walls, the warp roils with eternal hatred. But it can't touch us. Not tonight. I lean back against the console, closing my eyes for a moment's respite. The Emperor protects. I whisper to the darkness, and in the soft, constant thrum enveloping the ship, I swear I can almost hear a reply.